2016, the majority of the voting population, those that voted to leave the European Union, and I won't rehearse the reasons why. I think that debate has been settled, hopefully. In the political terms, we'll be moving on with, as Simon mentioned, the triggering of Article 50 and the process beyond. And Simon asked me to speak on the process and what's happened since the triggering, since the British ambassador to the European Union delivered that fateful letter written by Theresa May and enacting the process, hopefully, towards our freedom in the next few years. Exactly, I see a fan in the back there, which is brilliant. But the core process, and I think I'll just mention this briefly, albeit I think two sections here. I've been asked to speak for 20 minutes. I'll do 10 minutes on the process and 10 minutes on life after the process, hopefully. The first thing to say is that I believe the initial EU demands are completely unreasonable. In their initial draft negotiation plan has many points that are complete non-starters. And we as the United Kingdom and our embassies in Brussels and elsewhere should be prepared to stand up for the communities in Gibraltar and elsewhere. I've had discussions previously before this particular recording, and I don't see why Gibraltar was brought up. It is a UK territory, it is part of the United Kingdom as such, and it is just the opening gambit of the negotiation platform, which I hope from now the European Union will change its tact and act more in good faith as good negotiators. Because, of course, if they don't, then they're likely to get short shrift, or at least I hope they do, from their counterparts in Whitehall. The fear that I have, though, from the negotiation process, the start of the negotiation process, is that we've started off on this foot. Gibraltar was never meant to be a bargaining chip. It was never meant to be in the process. It was not talked about during the referendum, not talked about before. It's not an issue that we should really dwell on, but it's something that the European Union has brought up, I fear, also to distract the British media and us from the other things that they've included in their draft negotiations. And the other things include ideas that it's the European Council that decides the progress of the negotiations, the talks, so that during the negotiations, as laid out in the current plan, they will be able to decide whether an area has been resolved or not, and so possibly stopping the progress of talks going forward. Another key issue, though, is about the regulations which the United Kingdom has domestically. The potential understanding within this draft negotiation is that the UK would have to harmonise its laws, potentially even post-Brexit, to what the European Union demands, which, as a sovereign nation, would be completely unacceptable. I think, hopefully, we could all agree on that. The view here, though, is what happens next. Now, Dominic Raab, writing in Conservative Home, was putting forward an optimistic perspective on the negotiation demands. He said that the Gibraltar idea was a bit of a red herring, and ultimately he believes that Britain's in a very good position going forward with these negotiations, and I think potentially we are. Of course, we could put forward our plans to tackle and to effectively negotiate with good faith the problems that may be surrounding the EU deal, and go forward from there to actually have a very healthy relationship with the European Union, its countries and the people within the European Union going forward. I see there's no real barrier, no real reason why we shouldn't. But I have a lot of sympathy, given what's happened, given what's been produced by the European Union thus far, with the argument of John Redwood. So writing in Comment Central, which is somewhere where I also write in quite frequently, John Redwood was saying, he's very happy to walk away if there is no deal and the EU is progressing as it currently is, negotiating, looking to negotiate in bad faith. And that he's very happy that the Prime Minister, Theresa May, who, thank you, Simon, for reminding me about my few months in her office, was basically saying no deal is better than a bad deal. And I think that's a perspective that David Cameron didn't have going into his negotiations with the European Union a couple of years ago, and something that I think the Prime Minister should have in going into negotiations with the EU at this time and even beyond. My thought on John Redwood's piece was that he comes from it in a very different manner. He says the EU should be looking to gain access to our market, seeing it not as the United Kingdom, and many is portrayed in the media, the potential of access in the EU's market, but actually, of course, because the EU-UK trade imbalance with the deficit of goods and other particular products going from the within the UK and the EU trading balance, that the EU should look to the UK market and maintain their access with us. And frankly, as a libertarian-minded individual, the idea of governments getting involved in all of this is particularly annoying in a way, because of course trade is done between individuals and companies, not necessarily between countries, albeit some defence contracts may bear otherwise. The point, though, is in terms of the negotiations, that we should be viewing ourselves with a very positive hand to deal. And that's something that I think we should, as our diplomats beef up their representation in Brussels, really feel confident about, that they have the British interests at heart and that we are holding many aces in the pack going forward into the negotiations. But the process will, I think, if it's adopted with the current negotiation standpoint, with the current EU Brexit negotiation framework, will pose problems with the United Kingdom. And I'm not just talking about Gibraltar, I'm talking about the divorce bill, so-called divorce bill that they want to levy against the United Kingdom, which I find wholly unacceptable. The idea that they have control over how things progress within the negotiation, and indeed with the harmonisation point that I made earlier. And going on to that harmonisation point, it's not just about leaving the EU to adopt everything from the EU. We have a wider world out there that we want to capitalise on in terms of this wonderful opportunity to leave and to liberate the United Kingdom from the dead hand of Brussels and Strasbourg, and to allow our companies and individuals to trade with new markets and emerging markets around the world. And to do that, we don't need a great adoption bill whereby the United Kingdom merely replaces everything that the EU has framed over many years, over indeed a generation. It needs to actually repeal these regulations and laws. Now, Ian and I in the Cutting the Gordian Knot set out our ideas surrounding that. The ability to set up a royal commission that would act in parallel as the government gets on with the business of negotiating not just the trade deal with the EU, but also trade deals with other nations around the world to help open up markets and give further opportunities. And at the same time, this Royal Commission would be working to give suggestions and ideas as to how the UK could repeal these laws before we actually leave the EU's market. And of course there have been many interesting and very well thought out proposals from people like Mark Littlewood of the IEA, who I know has spoken here before, saying that there should be a sunset clause surrounding this process so that there is in effect a cut-off date for this dead hand legislation and regulation to no longer be affecting our lives. For me, of course, and for Ian, the idea of that is broadly a positive one if, of course, there are sensible, well thought through laws that can be implemented, if needed at all, in the UK statute books. And for that, I also see, and I want to highlight here, potential pitfalls before I move on very quickly onto the potential that we have outside the EU, because the pitfalls in the unwinding the legislation come in multiple forms. They include the Select Committee for Exiting the EU, which indeed Dominic Raab sits on. It's very positive about Hilary Benn, which is the chairman, Hilary Benn MP, obviously the son of Tony Benn. Very different political outlook from Tony Benn, but nonetheless, he's the chairman of this committee, and the committee itself has produced a wholly negative report about British interests, in my view, going forward in these negotiations. And we need a Brexit committee, in this case, that is fully resourced, fully able to analyse and critically scrutinise, but also is not hung up on the debates of last year. We need to move on as a political, with political discussions, to see what happens next and the potential for the United Kingdom in negotiating a very good deal with the EU, as with other nations, alongside the negotiation process internally within the UK. Now, I don't see that currently happening with the EU Exiting Committee, and I hope it will change its profile and its approach in the next weeks and months going forward. And another group of people within Parliament that I think is going to be a particularly important, but also particularly, how do I describe it diplomatically, troublesome group, might be the SNP within the Westminster Parliament, because they seem so hung up on the independence of Scotland in the short and medium term future that they're not focused on making the best for Brexit. And the best for Brexit, the successful outcome of Brexit, would also be a success for Scotland as well. So my thoughts would be for the SNP to refocus and to try to act constructively within Westminster to frame new legislation that benefits Scotland, as well as the wider United Kingdom. They are represented very heavily, some may say overly represented in Westminster. They need to make that clout shown. They need to make their voice heard. And to do so constructively within the process, I think would be of huge benefit to the rest of the United Kingdom, and indeed the people of Scotland. But I just want to, and I hope I have time for this, move on to the possibilities outside the European Union, and indeed maybe talk about, and I shall talk about, not just maybe, but look at the sorts of things we could achieve in the short and medium term. And those things were talked about during the referendum campaign, about taking back control our trade policy, taking back control our courts, and taking back control our immigration policy. Now I know, and I'm sure there'll be questions afterwards about immigration controls and systems and what have you. But the point that I would argue in terms of the very base understanding is that the United Kingdom now can define what immigration system it wants going forward. And given the makeup of not everyone's vote, of course, and not everyone's leave vote, but actually one of the three most important segments of the leave vote during the referendum campaign being a vote on immigration, we need to make an immigration system that doesn't cut off the United Kingdom, as some on the left say that those leavers who wanted to leave, and little Englanders and what have you, desired. Now, I don't believe that, firstly, that leavers were little Englanders, and secondly, I believe that we can now make an immigration system, as laid out in Ian and my pamphlet, Cutting the Gordian Knot, that actually is nationality neutral, free market, able to stimulate a growing demand for highly skilled individuals from around the world to come to the United Kingdom, but also to maintain our current relationships with countries within the European Union and beyond. So, and I'm hoping to have that discussion afterwards in the Q&A. But the second point would be about taking back control of our courts. Now, Stephen Wolfe, MEP, UKIP MEP, or formerly UKIP MEP in the European Parliament, said on another blog, Brexit Central, just recently, that if we stay in the European arrest warrant after we leave the European Union, we haven't actually left the European Union. And I completely agree with that. Leaving the EU and the European Court of Justice allows us to reframe our extradition agreement with the EU, along with many other things. And I'm just talking about the European arrest warrant because of a current case, indeed, not just a current case, a current case of injustice that's happening now in London, and that of Alexander Adamescu, who some of you may have heard of, but is a he's a German national wanted by the Romanian government on effectively trumped-up charges with no evidence to back it up, but under the extradition agreement that we have with the European Union at this time, a British judge cannot assess the evidence, there's no respect to due process, in Romania this is, and of course in Romania, as with many other nations around the European Union, there is no such thing as habeas corpus. In some cases, there's no such thing as trial by jury. And countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, and others have been constantly reprimanded by groups such as Fair Trials International and Human Rights Watch and others for their lack of standards within their judicial system. And yet we are tying ourselves to these countries when it comes to our judicial process. But then that's just one illustration of a huge variety of laws that could be unwound and reframed going forward after we leave the ECJ and take back control of our courts. Now, the third area I wanted to mention was trade deals, and taking back control of our trade policy, I think, is a benefit to the United Kingdom more broadly. Now, that's more broad in also concerning areas such as fishing and farming, which have over many years, indeed since we joined the EEC, been given over to the European Union. And the now European Union, then the EEC, has framed systems of control that has not suited the UK's fishing and farming industries. Now, outside the European Union, we can reframe those industries to suit British farmers and British fishermen. But more than that, actually be able to compete in a wider world with trade departments. This is something that's completely new for the United Kingdom for this generation, and yet has been practiced very liberally with our market competitors, so to speak, in Norway, along with Iceland and many other countries around the world. Now, and that's just fishing. If you're talking about other industries, this gives us huge opportunities as a national political entity to go out and, in effect, bat for Britain. So, in conclusion, of the taking back control over those three areas gives us huge potential going forward, but it cannot be underestimated the importance of being able to make our own legislation, freeing up our own in the United Kingdom going forward. If we do adopt the EU's regulations and their standards wholesale and do not change them, then merely we haven't really left the European Union in spirit. And we need to change those regulations, we need to repeal those that are unnecessary, and we need to reframe the United Kingdom in a way that benefits people in the UK and at the same time competes on a global scale that can benefit those outside the UK, whether it be in the European Union or not. This year, I think, is the 200th anniversary of Ricardo's law of competitive advantage, and I won't go into the detail on it. There's a wonderful video by Dan Hannan online if you want to hear it explained in more depth. But here is a chance for us to leverage our global industries, leverage the industries that have been previously captured by EU law, and in a way take back control over our future and destiny and make it for the benefit of people in the UK and those in a more global outlook. I'll just stop there and take questions. Thank you very much for hearing me witter on for the past 20 minutes or so.
Right, who's got Michael.
So what is your primary recommendation on how to handle what seem like malicious requests up front? Because in that bargaining situation, you can't